Wonderful. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our roundtable on the media and racism. I would like to use this opportunity to thank Reach Edmonton for providing technical support for the session. And we have Clayton and Rie who are supporting us behind the scenes. So thank you very much. Next slide. So to introduce myself, my name is Rose Eva Forks-Jenkins, and I work as a researcher and public educator at the Center for Race and Culture. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a settler on Treaty 6 territory. I'll be providing a short introduction before handing it over to Gurvinder to moderate for the rest of the session. And I'll also be moderating the chat box and Q&A, so please feel free to share your comments and questions with us there. And there will be 50 minutes of Q&A at the end of the session. Next slide. So even though we might not be gathered on the same physical space today for this webinar, we wanted to acknowledge that the Center for Race and Culture operates on Treaty 6 territory and invite everyone to reflect on the land that you yourself are on and wherever this may be. I wanted to take time to acknowledge that the reason that we're doing this presentation as a webinar is due to the COVID virus, and talk about how COVID-19 disproportionately affects Indigenous peoples. Indigenous Services Canada has stated that they recognize that First Nation, Inuit, and Métis are among the most vulnerable and face unique challenges in addressing COVID-19. For example, there are currently boil water advisories in 61 Indigenous communities across Edmonton as of February this year. To quote the title of Dallas Hunt and Gina Star Blankett's Globe and Mail article from May this year, the virus doesn't discriminate, but responses to it do. With this acknowledgement, I'd like to remind all of us here today of the responsibilities that we have as treaty people, and to understand our shared colonial history and work together towards a just future that includes and enriches all peoples. Next slide. So I want to talk a bit about the Center for Race and Culture. And since its establishment in 1993, the Center for Race and Culture has brought together diverse people with an interest in promoting and supporting individual, collective, and systemic change to address discrimination and racism, and to encourage intercultural understanding. Taking an intersectional approach, our expertise spans workplace development, community building, research, and education. And if you'd like to hear more about our current events, projects, and activities that CFRAC is working on, please visit our website and sign up for our newsletter. And next slide. So to tell you a bit more about this series specifically, so this session is part of a new initiative entitled Challenging Discrimination Through Community Conversations, an ongoing series of online moderated roundtables and webinars with guest speakers from diverse communities, organizations, academia, and the general public. We seek to understand and address experiences of discrimination and exclusion in the Canadian context. By shining the spotlight on different forms of discrimination, we hope to encourage solidarity among groups and individuals interested in promoting social inclusion and equity. Next slide, please. So this is a community-based initiative, and we welcome ideas and suggestions for collaboration. Don't hesitate to reach out to my colleagues Mansoure and Miriam if you'd like to be part of future conversations. You can also use the feedback form that we will provide at the end of this presentation to share your thoughts and questions with us. And next slide, I'm going to introduce the panelists that we're very grateful could join us today. So first we have Anita Li, who's a media strategist and consultant with a decade of experience as a multi-platform journalist at outlets across North America. She's also a journalism professor at the City University of New York and Centennial College in Toronto, as well as a member of the Online News Association's Board of Directors. In late 2018, Anita co-founded Canadian Journalists of Color, a rapidly growing network of Black, Indigenous, people of color media makers in Canada. And next we have, on the next slide, we have Oumar Salifou, who worked as a reporter in Edmonton since 2015. His work on culture and politics has appeared on CBC, CJSR, and the Let's Find Out podcast. And from 2018 to 2019, he served as the editor-in-chief of The Gateway. And on the next slide, we have Kalyani Thurairajah. And Kalyani Thurairajah is an associate professor in the sociology department at MacEwan University. Her teaching and research interests are in the areas of multiculturalism, immigration, and racism. She's currently examining how national identities and belonging are racialized and the impacts of multiculturalism on these processes. She also studies new media, how media frames racialized populations as other in society. Next, on the next slide, we have Kyle Muzyka. So Kyle Muzyka is a Métis and Cree journalist from Treaty 8 and currently an associate producer for CBC Unreserved. He's worked at CBC for more than 5 years, including the National Indigenous Unit and locally in Edmonton and Yellowknife, sorry. And then next up and last of all, we have Gurvinder Bhatia. So Gurvinder Bhatia is a wine editor for Quench Magazine, wine columnist for Global Television Edmonton, an international wine judge and the president of Vinomania Consulting. Gurvinder was the wine columnist for CBC's Radio Edmonton AM for 11 years and holds both a law degree and a master's in business administration. So before turning it over to Gurvinder to moderate, I wanted to take a quick poll. So this poll will show up on your screen for 1 minute. If you could please answer these questions, it would be helpful for us to know more demographic questions about our participants. We're asking these questions because race-based data is not always widely available. And this lack of data makes it harder to prove that concepts such as systemic racism are a part of society. So by providing this information, you will help us gain a more in-depth understanding of these concepts. And if you're not comfortable answering these questions, you can choose do not answer, and that's totally fine, whatever you're comfortable with. So thank you very much. Okay, so about 10 seconds left. Great, so thank you so much for providing that information. We really appreciate it. And so next I will hand it over to Gurvinder for the rest of the session.
Thank you, Rosiva. I would like to thank the Center for Race and Culture for inviting me to moderate this roundtable today on the topic of racism and the media. Systemic racism is entrenched within media organizations, and the manner in which the media covers stories on race perpetuates racism because stories are framed through the lens of a workforce that lacks ethnic and racial diversity. The majority of editors, producers, writers, and reporters lack the context, perspective, and experience to know or acknowledge the existence of other perspectives outside of their reality. Their reality is one that creates a limited narrative that does not reflect the realities and lived experiences of a significant portion of the population. This significantly impacts the public's perception of issues of race if the media frames these stories only through one lens. Media organizations are representative of the systemic racism that exists and is ingrained in our society. Systemic racism has become normalized in our society, and the media have contributed to that. In the week immediately after the killing of George Floyd, most stories in local media focused on protests turning violent. There was initially no mention of systemic racism and why Floyd's murder served as a catalyst to the protests. It was only after pressure mounted and more people publicly expressed their outrage did the media's coverage start to look beyond a singular perspective. Significantly, most on-air media, particularly at the local level, have little real-world experience beyond their narrow perspective when it comes to stories related to race or issues faced by Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Our discussion this afternoon will focus on the role that the media plays in our society, the manner in which the media frames stories on race, the gaps in the media's coverage of these stories, the impact of these gaps, and suggestions for real change to challenge the systemic racism that exists in media organizations. I'm pleased to be joined by our esteemed panelists. Why don't we start with the question, what is the function of media in our society and what is the responsibility of media? Do they have a moral responsibility given the significant influence and impact on the public's perception of stories covered in the media? And why don't we start with Kalyani? What are your thoughts on this?
Thanks, Gurvinder. As a sociologist, when we talk about functions of things like the media, we talk about them as agents of socialization, right? So family, education, media are all agents of socialization. So they teach society what the values and norms of that society is. So by showing us what our role in society is, how we're supposed to relate to others. So when we think about who is shown in the media, they're telling us a lot about what their place in society is, right? So when populations are rendered invisible, media is suggesting that they don't have a place, they don't have a role, or that they're not significant or powerful in shaping the society around them. However, it's important that when we're thinking about this, that we're not thinking about the moral responsibility of media, because when we start thinking about morality, it gets into individual philosophy, right? How does your religion guide you? How does your own spirituality or your philosophical views of the other guide you? I think we need to think of it as the ethical responsibility of the media. Every industry has its own code of ethics meant to be around eliminating or at least decreasing the harm that is done. So how does media intentionally work to reduce harm? How are they ensuring that when they are pitching those stories, when the writers are working on those stories, when the journalists are investigating those stories, when they're being put out, that they are working to reduce the harm that is being done through those stories on not just the populations that are being represented in those stories, but also the population that is consuming stories of those others, and further than perpetuating the stereotypical views they have. So media plays a really powerful role in teaching us what the values and norms are, but they don't exist in a silo, right? They work in tandem with all of these other social institutions, and it's really important that they take responsibility for that important role that they play.
Any of the other panelists would like to express their opinion on this as well?
Yeah, I can say something. I often say that media is a pillar of democracy, and given that so many, democracies around the world are there are real threats being posed to them. We, as journalists, our role is even more salient and essential in this day and age. So I find that if the goal is to, media is a pillar of democracy, there's a lot of research that shows that when individuals don't have access to news, especially local news that reflects their lived experiences, they're less likely to engage civically, they're less likely to vote, and they're also less likely to trust their neighbors. So in a way, if we, as journalists, if we're not responsible in the way we, conduct ourselves and the way we produce journalism, then we're only creating a hotbed for polarization and misinformation and disinformation, which, as we all can see, is widespread today. So to me, we definitely have to think of our ethical responsibilities as journalists now more than ever. I find that across the board in Canadian media, there's this kind of rote way of doing things that's just automatic, that we're not really self-critical enough about our own industry. And so I find a lot of major institutions in particular rest on their laurels. But we're in a different time, and there's a lot of underrepresented communities that are suffering, a lot of vulnerable communities that are being overlooked. And if we as journalists are not covering these communities in a way that is accurate and reflective of their realities, then we're doing disservice to the public fundamentally.
Anita, because of the prevalence of social media and the access to information, whether it's valid or not out there, does that increase the media's responsibility?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think so I often give a lot of workshops on fake news. And somehow, that we often talk about misinformation, disinformation as the responsibility of foreign incursions into our elections or into our media spaces, and a lot of deliberate disinformation on the parts of bad faith actors. But oftentimes, especially major media institutions in this country, we fail to look at the responsibility or our role that led to this kind of fundamental distrust in media. And that's because many different communities are just completely not part of the narrative, the narrative of Canada, of this country. And we're talking about a lot of racialized communities, but beyond that, just also people with disabilities, people from the LGBTQ plus community. We are doing a disservice, and this isn't just to, you know, BIPOC people or racialized people or people from those underrepresented communities. It's also to people who are identified with like the majority. They will fail to understand like what, you know, these underserved communities are all about, and that just creates further division. So I just want to emphasize the role, like the increasing distrust has a lot to do with like major media institutions just not serving the public in an inclusive way.
Can I jump in?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I really like how the conversation has been framed around, you know, a larger picture and, you know, a sociological picture of how the media is an agent of socialization. I think it's really important to also acknowledge that media companies are largely private companies. And, you know, some of them even have shareholders and are, you know, traded on the stock market. So they very much function as all businesses do, you know, in our capitalist system. So that means, you know, prioritizing revenues, making sure that, you know, things are running as businesses should. And for some corporations, you know, I think they've taken a turn towards, yeah, really focusing on making money rather than serving their communities. I think I also really want to comment on this idea of kind of, you know, Black people or people of color being missing from media. And I think that it's wrong to frame it that way, because Black people and Indigenous people have been in media in Edmonton for quite a while now. We get talked about, and we have been talked about for years, but the problem is that we only get talked about when Black people commit crime. You know, then you'll have the Somali community on the front page. You know, when we're talking about homelessness, then we'll talk about Indigenous people. But when it comes to treating communities with dignity, with respect, giving them the same kind of dignity and respect that's given to white people, that's nowhere to be seen. So if you want, you can go and look at major publications like CBC Edmonton, like the Edmonton Journal, Edmonton Sun even. Go into their archives, type in communities like Indigenous, Somalian. In the early 90s, even the Roma community that was Eastern European was talked about in very derogatory ways. So we are talked about in the media. The problem is that we're talked about in racist ways. And because newsrooms are completely white, we don't even get to have any control over what gets said about us. So I think that's kind of what I want to say.
Well, and Oumar, I mean, I think that's a good lead into the next question, which is there is little question that Black journalists, Indigenous journalists, and journalists of color are underrepresented in the media, particularly in decision-making roles. And unless there's an adequate representation with respect to on-air personalities, writers, producers, editors, managing editors, and publishers, is it possible for the media to frame stories on race from more than just a lens perpetuated by the systemic racism that's institutionalized in society and media organizations? Why don't we go to Anita for that, because I know you've spoken quite a bit on that one.
Yeah, absolutely. So we often, you know, especially in Canadian journalism, we're very, in my opinion, obsessed with this notion of objectivity, which is a really antiquated notion and has been actually challenged for decades now by a lot of media scholars, right? So nothing I'm saying here is really new, but I've always, in particular at, like, I will say CBC, there's like this notion of balance as like reflective of the truth or reality, but that's not true. Like, for example, if you're going to cover a story on Black Lives Matter, it's unfair to equate the words of a Black Lives Matter activist with a white supremacist, especially given that in this country, multiculturalism and human rights are entrenched in our constitution. It makes no sense. It makes no sense that we privilege that perspective. It's you know, unethical, it's amoral. It's not even something that is entrenched in the values of this country. So that's something that needs to be challenged. I think that currently, given the systemic racism in the industry, it is very hard to, unless you have a newsroom that is reflective of the Canadian populace at all levels, and particularly at management levels, because they are the ones that set the editorial vision and they're the ones who assign the stories, then it's very hard to produce journalism that is fair and accurate and completely truthful, because it's the objective lens or the default lens is really, you know, a homogenous white lens oftentimes, you know, and the stats bear out and they show that. So I think it is quite a challenge, at least at major media institutions, to produce journalism that is fair and accurate, in my opinion, or at least holistic enough that covers all the nuances of a particular community. And speaking to what Oumar said, it's not necessarily that, I actually still believe that we're underserved, many racialized communities are underserved, but I feel also strongly that there's a lot of stereotypical and reductive coverage of the communities when they are being covered. So that's obviously an issue. But the one thing I also want to say as like a more optimistic note is that in the last little while, and I've said this for a while now, there's been an explosion of digital media outlets in this country. So there's a growing ecosystem that's really challenging establishment's way of doing things. And I think for me, that real change will happen not only internally, through the work that I'm doing at CJOC, for example, but also externally, when a lot of, journalists, and I recognize that this requires some level of privilege, start, pursuing entrepreneurial journalism, start creating their own outlets that reflect their own lived experiences. So I'm not, knocking on these folks' doors to be like, please cover me accurately. Obviously that needs to happen, but I'm also very much of the mind that, we can create what we want to see, and we can create the change that we want to see as well.
Kyle, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, what everybody's been saying is sort of, exactly sort of the things that I've been thinking about for a little while here. I think in regards to covering Indigenous people, one of my colleagues, Duncan McHugh, wrote this story, and he was the one who told me this. I'm sure he wasn't the first to come up with it, but it's certainly poignant. He talks about a lot of the times when people cover Indigenous people, he talks about the 4 Ds. It's either they're drunk, they're dead, they're drumming, or they're dancing. And that's just not good enough, frankly. It's not just every major media outlet is responsible. CBC has made a lot of strides, but still has a long way to go in terms of covering race fairly. You have to understand too, when we're talking about ethics, there are codes of ethics that many organizations have. CBC for example, has its journalism standards and practices, but, you also really have to think about who wrote these journalist standards and practices. And it's often white people, I would probably almost guarantee that it was. And so, now there's this whole reckoning where people are finally starting to understand. I mean, I've been personally, have had a lot of trouble trying to understand where I fit in with the journalism standard and practices, because there's a lot of things that I experience. I don't experience direct racism because I'm pretty white passing as a Métis person, but all the racism that I see happening on the daily, I feel like I should be able to speak out about it, and our JSP doesn't really allow us to do that. So now there's finally this reckoning about rewriting it and trying to understand it through a more inclusive lens. But it's amazing that it took this long, frankly, because when you think about who is writing these types of codes of ethics, and if it's through a white lens, I mean, it doesn't really strike me as fair. And so and somebody else mentioned, before, I think it was Anita, talking about entrepreneurial journalism. I mean, some of the stuff that's been coming out of Edmonton in the past little while alone has been terrific. And, the fact that people like Oumar, have finally, like Oumar just recently started a podcast. If you haven't heard it, it's called Is This For Real? It's great. One of the things that is great about this is that he doesn't really have any restrictions or parameters. He can talk about what he wants to talk about, what he thinks is important. And there's obviously an audience for that. So I certainly think, again, like Anita said, there obviously is around like a form of privilege that has to do with that type of entrepreneurial stuff. But at the end of it, there seems to be more and more of an audience for it. And I think the major outlets are really dragging behind in that.
Do you mind
Oumar?
if I jump in, or?
Please go ahead.
So yeah, Kyle mentioned that I did start a podcast recently, and I just want to make a quick comment on this idea that, you know, digital outlets or startups like Is This For Real are going to be, you know, an alternative to the problem of mainstream Canadian media. I think the only issue with that solution is that organizations like Is This For Real or startups like Canada Land, for example, have a very, very, very long way to go before they are viewed as legitimate as CBC, the Globe and Mail, or Post Media, for example. And I think media should also be viewed through the lens of, you know, business and power and government, because communications and journalism are almost hand in hand in a lot of ways. And the way that journalists work are almost entrenched with government communications, police communications, you name it, corporate communications. And because media has declined so much in terms of business model and revenue over the past decades, communications has been able to eat up more jobs. So when we talk about how media functions and how often media uncritically flips communications, I guess, propaganda or just messages, I think then you can start to understand how the system works and how the problems are perpetuated within the system. And I think with that being understood, you can kind of see how, you know, online startups might not be the best solution to the problem that we have now.
Can I just jump in
Please.
after that, because Oumar offered me an amazing segue there. I think, because when we think about the media framing stories on race versus framing stories about racism, right? And I think some of the things that ends up happening is we think that anytime the media represents racialized populations, it's supposed to be about either perceived problems that they're creating in society or the experiences, the challenges that they experience in society, so racism. But we're not seeing the stories that illustrate their humanity, how they are beyond these other opportunities, as Anita, Kyle, and Oumar talked about, right? So when you move away from mainstream media, then we're seeing those stories. However, it ends up creating a lot of fragmentation by the audience. Who is listening to those stories? Who's most likely to believe in the humanity of these racialized populations? And the people who are challenging that, the ones who are consuming mainstream media, are continuing to get those stories of you only see me when you see me either causing some kind of problem or experiencing some kind of problem. So we still need to address how we talk about racialized populations through mainstream media in a lot of ways. And I think part of it is absolutely representation across all levels, but it's also representation across all storylines that we take. So we see sometimes, you know, all the networks have this sort of like, CBC National has their sort of, what is it called, moment of the day, or something that they highlight at the very end of their segment, or local news has a story about just a common everyday activity. And those stories are often about white Canadians. So you see them living their everyday lives, but we don't see the everyday lives of non-white Canadians. So often then they're only brought to the surface when they're either blamed for crime or for causing social problems. Like it's because of them that there's drug issues, or it's because of them that we have high unemployment, or it's because they are shown as victims. Oh, look at the fact that they don't have any wealth, or they're facing racism. But we don't show them as humans who are who have agency, who are living and showing resilience and loving beyond their experience of racism. And now I want to be careful here, of course, as populations who are racialized not to be white, that is part of our everyday lived experience. But that is not the story I need to tell every single time I talk to someone. All of my stories are not about me being racialized as someone who's brown, right? It's about the fact that I love reading romance novels and I'll skip to the end of a book. But that story is not being, yes, I do that. So that story is not being shown. And I think we need to talk about the fact that those stories are being shown by people who are moving away from mainstream media, which is fantastic. But then the people who are consuming those stories are the people who want to hear that. And we need to see mainstream media also making that shift towards showing the multitude of stories that exist for all of these populations.
May I respond to that? But I also know we've been on this question for a long time. So Gurvinder, if you want to continue.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, great. Yeah. So Kalyani and Oumar had some really good points that I want to just add to. For me, I think it's like fundamentally change will come from like it's a two-pronged approach, which is something that I, as an individual, have taken. That's the approach I'm taking, where there has to be, you know, change from within the inside of the system, the establishment system, and then also change happening, or not change, just like the growth of an alternative kind of media ecosystem, a digital media ecosystem. And for me, I see them as like not separate. It's a holistic kind of system whereby if there are successful alternative media startups that serve a particular audience, there's going to be impact on establishment media where they see like that there's audience, like that there's an audience for this particular kind of this particular kind of story. And so that the hope is that eventually they're going to be able to like start producing those kind of stories as well. And from my perspective, as somebody who worked at The Discourse, which is a community-driven journalism outlet based in Vancouver, I started covering Scarborough's Focus News, which is Scarborough is like a suburb of the GTA, and it's 70% racialized. It's where I'm from originally. When I started covering that in earnest, and just like what Kalyani said about like just covering everything, not just like the fact that these folks are racialized or like vulnerable, I started seeing more coverage of Scarborough in a holistic way from CBC and the Toronto Star. The other thing that I quickly want to add is that these digital media startups are also not experimenting only in terms of journalism innovation, but also revenue models. That's like something that I specialize in, audience engagement and revenue. And historically, a lot of publications have relied on advertising. And as I'm sure many people here know, Google and Facebook have been cannibalizing ad dollars. And the result of that is that you kind of produce this outlet, or it's a kind of outlet that it produces assembly line news, right? You're not serving your audience, you're serving advertisers, a third party. And the kind of things that, you know, advertisers are interested in are clickbait, because they, you know, generate, you know, you click something, you get like ad money from that. And so a lot of these digital outlets are actually experimenting more and more with subscription and membership-based models that cut out the middleman. And therefore, you're actually serving your audience directly. And if your audience finds your journalism of value, they're going to pay for that. So it's a virtuous cycle. So that's kind of how you break. I mean, this is, you know, addresses the issue of like unrelenting growth in capitalistic business models, which is like just not sustainable. And it also just creates a closer, more intimate relationship between the publisher and readership. So to me, this is the work that I'm doing. Like I'm thinking about it from multiple angles, not just from the journalism production, but also the business side. It's actually why I entered the business side of media, because like Oumar said, money is at the center of power. And that's oftentimes how if you tackle it that way, you have a greater chance of success. And it's still early days, but I've seen a lot of cool things come out of the US and Canada around this kind of experimentation. So I'm actually quite optimistic about the potential for change in the next little while.
Well, from the business perspective, isn't mainstream media missing out on a significant audience by not covering stories that in a way that can relate to a large portion of the population?
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like I'm taking up a lot of air, so forgive me, but I absolutely. In fact, this is actually, I was interviewing for an editor-in-chief position at an establishment organization that will remain nameless. And they had just undergone a lot of layoffs. And so I was kind of appealing to them. Usually when I onboard people about teaching them about diversity and they're really new to it, I start with the business case, and then I go to the civic or democratic case, and then I go to the moral imperative. And as much as I would love people to just understand the humanity behind like storytelling that's inclusive, I understand that not everybody is starting from that perspective. So I try to go from the business perspective. And so you're absolutely right in that they're losing out on audience or reader revenue. They're relying so much on advertising. I haven't really spoken to a lot of Canadian media leaders who are thinking about this actively, which is very alarming because we're already quite behind as an industry. And the thing is, that's why I'm actually not so concerned, because if they're not going to pay attention to audience in a meaningful way that is inclusive, they're going to feel the impact on their bottom line. So it's only a matter of time, in my opinion. I know that's like a very confident statement to make, but just from what I've observed in the research I've seen and just where the industry is going, like if they're not heeding this, like they're going to feel it. And that's why so many of these papers have also like suffered a lot, like downsized. They can't rely on advertising revenue anymore. It has to be mixed revenue, kind of many different revenue sources, and audience is actually one where it's like very sustainable in the long term.
Absolutely. The concept of journalistic objectivity has been touched on already, but it's often referred to as the rationale for presenting different sides of an issue from a neutral position. But is objectivity possible without context, perspective, and analysis? And objectivity should not be a barrier to telling the truth, but the real truth, and not a limited narrative of a homogenous group of editors and decision makers that does not reflect the realities and lived experiences of a significant portion of the population. So the question to the panelists is the concept of journalistic objectivity being used as a crutch to insist that media have to present both sides of a story and refuse to take a stand against what is wrong in favor of what is right? And given the lack of racial diversity in the media, particularly at the decision-making level, is journalistic objectivity consistent with being able to effectively and responsibly cover stories involving race and stories about issues facing Black, Indigenous, and people of color? Oumar, why don't we start with you?
I think I can speak on the idea generally of objectivity to just start, because I think that all of these terms can be manipulated, and it's not something that I think anyone has ever been able to say, you know, this is objectivity for what it is, and, you know, we can move forward from this starting point, and then, you know, this is the right way, and then let's go from here. Because when you look at the state of journalism, at least in Edmonton, you know, we have newsrooms where the same kind of person is in every kind of job. So when we talk about diversity or difference of perspective or objectivity, you know, how objective are you when you only represent one community? How objective are you when you go to the same sources time and time again and they give you the same information? You know, how objective are you if, you know, the same narratives get peddled over and over again, and narratives that fall in the favor of, you know, the elite essentially, and fall in the disfavor of whoever they don't want to be favorable? So I just think it's one of those things where these terms were never really, you know, set in stone. They were kept obtuse in order for people who are in decision-making positions to be able to, you know, just like meld it to fit whatever, you know, works for themselves. And again, that group is largely homogenous in race, homogenous in lived experience, people who all go to, you know, really good universities, people who all have the same cultural cues. These are, you know, what newsrooms have been for decades, and what they largely still are. So I think it's important to note that. And I think it's also something to consider and to ask is if we swap out one of those things. So for example, if newsrooms are still completely homogenous when it comes to lived experience, when it comes to, you know, class, economic status, if they're still homogenous in terms of ideology or, you know, thinking, but they're more diverse racially, have we really solved the problem, or are we just perpetuating the same things?
Can I jump in?
Go ahead.
Sorry, Kyle. Go ahead, Kyle.
Okay, I'll take it. Yeah, I mean, totally, it's totally bang on, Oumar. You know, I think, you know, when we're talking about newsrooms and, you know, the lack of diversity, you know, I think it goes to show, like, it doesn't really matter what the newsroom looks like, you're generally going to have and pitch and write more stories that directly affect the people in said newsroom. So like, if all of the people in your newsroom live in Summerside or Glenora or Highlands or, you know, other rich neighborhoods, you're much more likely to get stories about those neighborhoods. And when, you know, there's an issue or whatever, or, you know, LRT constructions or whatever. When you're talking about this profession, I think, is very is a very privileged profession, and it's really, really hard for marginalized people who are of lower socioeconomic background to really get a start here. And what makes it doubly difficult is that even if everything breaks right and they still get a chance, makes it doubly challenging that they're looked as biased if they pitch stories about their own communities. If there's somebody from a community here who pitches stories, editors are often looking at them as as sort of like you have a bias or whatever, when in reality, I mean, white people in the newsroom pitch stories about their white communities all the time and nobody says anything. So, and it's just because that's viewed as the norm. So how do we stop this perception of, if I pitch a story about the Métis community here, how do we stop the perception of bias? And how do we convince the mostly white upper management level to understand that I can still come to this story from a fair perspective and point of view, even though that's the community in which I identify?
So do we need to take an approach in terms of when we look at hiring practices in bringing more people into decision-making roles in mainstream media? And there was an article in the Globe and Mail on the weekend with the dean of the Faculty of Design at the Ontario College of Art and Design University, and basically, the approach they've taken is to hire in sets of 3 to achieve a critical mass of Black employees and entrusting them with power at the top level, influence in the middle level, and growth at the entry level. So perhaps media organizations, declaring an intent to diversify their hiring practices isn't enough. Maybe the organizations need to hire people of color and Indigenous people in numbers and entrust them with power, influence, and opportunities for growth to frame stories through more than just one homogenous lens, and represent the diversity that actually exists in our society, but also make those places of work also much more welcoming to people of color and Indigenous people.
I just think it's important for us to separate representation through populations being hired and objectivity, because irrespective of your race, gender, class, you can't be objective. This whole idea of people being objective is just false. All of us are shaped by our positionalities, our social locations, right? The way we see the world is shaped by who we are and our experiences of the world. Obviously, those who have never had to address their race, who have never experienced the world being shaped by their race, experience it differently than those who have faced barriers as a result of race. But so simply hiring someone because they are not white does not necessarily mean they're going to be objective. I think we need to really force those who are working in the media to be reflexive, to ensure that they are taking time to think through, well, what are all of the things that shape the kinds of stories that I'm interested in? Where does that come from? What are all of the things that I'm not interested in? And we need to have a diversity of those perspectives being represented. And of course, that also means a diversity of perspectives shaped by race and ethnicity. But it's not just introducing that, because as Oumar pointed out, if they're all of the same class and they've had the same cultural experiences, just having racial diversity doesn't mean diversity of viewpoints. If anything, that's even more dangerous, because then that organization could say, but look, it was the Black guy who said that, so it's okay. So then we justify racism with that. So I'm not a journalist, I'm an academic, and when we do research, one of the things we talk about is there's no such thing as objective research. Every research project that I undertake is shaped by the things I'm interested in, and when I do interviews with my participants, it's shaped by what I want to know, and how I interpret and analyze that data is shaped by those things. So part of the process of doing research is actually being reflexive to that, paying attention to that, writing it down, documenting it, sharing it when I share my results, that, hey, let me situate myself so you know how these things may have influenced the data. And I wish more journalists were paying attention to that. I think they're often trained to believe that they can just see the world clearly, that they just see the world, but they don't realize that their vision is completely impacted by all of these social locations, and the way that they see the world is unique to them and is not like anyone else. So this whole objective reality thing is a false construct, and it can't be dismantled simply by introducing people from various racialized groups into the newsroom, but also by ensuring that all of those people who are part of the media are paying attention to things beyond just their race. Because like I said, it's not just your race that influences how you see the world.
Yeah, I really love that comment that you just made, and I think every journalist needs to do a lot of soul searching and ask themselves critically how they choose what stories they choose and why they choose what stories they choose, and how their background is constantly influencing the decisions that they make at work, despite what they're constantly being told, that they are objective and that everything that they do is fine because they have this stamp of objectivity.
And there's definitely a difference between being fair and being objective. You can be fair and understand that there isn't really any way to be objective in terms of how you view the world and what you see, which I think is something that we can strive for. But I think like Kalyani and Oumar, like they made really good points where they say that we first have to acknowledge that the way in which we choose our stories and the way editors specifically accept and reject pitches for stories is drastically shaped by their experience. That's something that we need to acknowledge first and foremost, I think.
Absolutely. Well, let's look at some constructive solutions for change. To me, it seems that the media are quick to draw attention to the transgressions and shortcomings of others while ignoring their own shortcomings beyond just providing lip service to diversity and inclusion. And there's a reluctance on the part of members of the media to participate in any sort of anti-racism education or training. I believe there's a lack of commitment on the part of the media organizations to change. In your opinion, how can we, in our positions, challenge systemic racism within media organizations? And Kyle, why don't we go to you first?
I think it's a lot of it is just kind of hitting it from as many areas as we possibly can. So, I think I've been trying to change from within locally at CBC Edmonton for, probably about 3 years. I've been working and sort of leading our inclusive committee, but the work is impossible if, management makes it so. And so, we have made a little bit of headway recently, but, a lot of that stuff, when we're talking about these types of committees that are, I'll speak specific to CBC, but I wager it's like this in other organizations as well. If you're serious about inclusivity and diversity, you can't have these types of committees working off the sides of their desk. They need to be paid for their work. And for the extra emotional labor, because a lot of the times it's people of color and racialized people who are leading these committees. It's important that that CBC and other organizations recognize the importance of this work all the way through. When we're talking about, diversity hires, for example, and I use air quotes on that. A vast majority of them are at CBC are casual employees or entry-level employees. And when you don't hire, when you're not hiring for middle management as much, those are the first people to get laid off. And so when we're talking about creating diverse spaces and then, coupling that with how much media has struggled, they're obviously the first to get laid off when things happen. So things aren't really being fixed in that case. But in terms of trying to tackle racism and systemic racism in a lot of these organizations and publications, I think we got to do it from all sides. I think there has to be people from the inside who are trying to change from within, and there also has to be people who are willing and able to call out the CBC when they're doing something racist, or they're being racist, or they're not understanding their role. Anita made a point that early on that I make all the time, and I'd like to bring it up again, is that this idea that we need to be responsible for our role in perpetuating systemic racism in this country, and we're not. And so when people like who are working within the organizations are able to bring this up from within, that's totally one effective-ish way to do something. But what really helps is the people on the outside who are able to call us out, and that's really what seems to get quicker change. In the work that I've done over the past 3 years, I feel like I have made hardly any progress. But when we're talking about the area in the last 2 months, it feels like it's really ramped up. And that's just because of public pressure. And that it seems to be what works better than working from within.
Anita?
Yeah, so I would love at this point to talk a bit about the calls to action that were put out by my organization, Canadian Journals of Color, just because we do prescribe some solutions. But I also want to say that we co-released it with the Canadian Association of Black Journalists, so I want to make that clear. So in January 2020, our organizations released 7 calls to action to strengthen newsroom diversity across the country. And there's a few things, like the most obvious thing is hire more people of color at all levels of the organization, particularly in management positions. The first call to action that we list is just being transparent about your demographic data, because you cannot fix something that you don't acknowledge. And I mean, I think Gurvinder mentioned that race-based data is like very sorely missing across industry in this country. And so that makes it very challenging. I don't think it was actually Gurvinder, but your organization mentioned, Rosiva, I think, said that you wanted to have the poll because you wanted to collect more data because it's just missing. And I think that's very essential also for the media industry. We also recommend having community advisory boards, but not something that's just useless or busy work. Like, have a community advisory board that really informs your editorial process and make sure that it changes up every 2 years so these people aren't tokenized. And the other thing I also want to mention, because this came up in my mind as the conversation was going, was our last call to action actually has to do with journalism schools. And this point isn't mentioned a lot in the industry, but they are the direct pipelines to these major organizations. And a lot of like the, I think, frankly, toxic ideas of what kind of journalism is the right kind of journalism, and all these really antiquated best practices are actually start at the journalism school level. And so what we need to do is also modernize journalism teaching to better reflect all of Canada. So that's something I really want to mention. And I don't know, Gurvinder, if you're going to be talking a bit more about the impact of the calls to action, because I would love to share that with the audience, but I'll stop there for now in case other people want to comment.
Well, now that, I mean, you brought that up, but I mean, the question that I have for you is, on the calls to action, what has the reaction been, and have any media organizations engaged the CABJ or the CJOC to assist in implementation? Yeah,
so when we first released the calls to action in January, I would say that they went semi-viral in the industry, in that like a lot of members of rank and file in Canadian journalism industry, as well as journalism academics and union folks, supported it and amplified it. And this was not just in Canada, this is also in the US and abroad. But we didn't really hear anything at all from establishment organizations until the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter protests started happening, and we resurfaced the calls to action. And from there, a bunch of places actually ended up endorsing it and reaching out to us. So we've had public endorsements of the calls to action from the Globe and Mail Union, from the Toronto Star, the Walrus, Global News, and a bunch of other emerging media outlets. And a bunch of other major organizations. We're in conversations with all the major ones. So CBC, CTV, Global, the Star, the Globe and Mail, like just many, many different organizations across the industry. And without going into too much detail, my counterpart at CABJ, Nadia Stewart, and I have developed a system where we've instituted checks and balances so that we're constantly checking in regularly with these organizations and helping them build out a long-term as well as a short-term roadmap for better diversity inclusion at these institutions. We also, this initial, like we emphasize to them that we're doing this initially to support them in their efforts, but that down the line, you know, this work has to be paid, because this is another aspect that I haven't mentioned, but that this labor is often like dismissed or undervalued, but it's actually really important, especially in this day and age. So I feel like I'm optimistic about the conversations. They really range from folks who are like already doing the work, who are educated and really enthusiastic. And those tend to be like the more startup, smaller organizations, and all the way to like folks who are, you know, they're willing, but they don't, and they're enthusiastic, but they don't really have they don't have any of the information, so they need some level of support. And then there's also, to be totally frank, a lot of organizations that just pay lip service and are, you know, think that they're already doing a really good job despite all the kind of negative feedback they're receiving. So they're just kind of resistant to any sort of change. And that actually, some of those organizations are some of the more challenging ones, some of the more progressive leaning ones that are not really self-aware. So it kind of runs the gamut. But I feel like we're making progress. But like I said earlier on, I'm not just, you know, doing the work, like challenging the system from an internal perspective. I'm also doing it externally I'm also starting my own media company. And so I think like through competition is the only way that a lot of these organizations are going to change. And like Kyle said, through public pressure. So in a nutshell, I think the calls to action have made a good amount of impact, and we have really sustained the conversation in the country alongside of a lot of other activists and advocates in media in this country. But we still definitely have a long way to go. And I'm not cynical, because I don't think that's helpful, but I'm cautiously optimistic, and I do have a healthy dose of skepticism. So yeah, well, it remains to be seen. We'll see how it goes.
You know, outrage is too often fleeting, and in the current environment, there is a lot of attention to the need for change. But how do we sustain the current focus on systemic racism that exists in all aspects of society, including the media, and actually create change? Or are we destined that this is going to be another brief period in history where change is demanded, yet the needle only marginally moves? Oumar, what do we need to do in order to sustain the pressures that is currently occurring for change?
I really don't have an answer here. And I don't think that cynicism is a good idea for anyone, because I think that as long as you're alive, you should still keep working towards, you know, improving the lives of people. But, you know, when I look at the system and, you know, what's happened since January, so since this year started, you have all the answers kind of in front of you, and you can already see how Black Lives Matter has made a lot of inroads, has been relatively successful, but has also failed in a lot of ways. And I think what Kyle said is a perfect example. You know, we have a whole panel about the problem of racism in media. So I have to ask, how much of a problem is this? You know, for management, for you know, dominant culture, for everyone. You know, how much of a problem is racism in your life? And when people bring up accusations of racism or systematic racism, does anything happen? The answer is no. The answer is no. And Kyle said that perfectly when he said, you know, I've been working on changing things internally at CBC Edmonton for years now, and nothing changed until a Black man was murdered on video for 8 minutes with a cop on his knee, or with a cop who had his knee on his neck, for the whole world to watch. That's what it took for Black Lives Matter to not be this like controversial statement. And it's obvious. You look at everything that's happened. Black Lives Matter used to be a controversial thing to say. I can't emphasize that more for people to understand. In 2016, when a lot of this was hitting a peak, if you said Black Lives Matter, if you included that in your profile, if you said, our organization supports that movement, you would be ostracized. A lot of people would view you as a radical person. White Lives Matter, All Lives Matter was a mainstream opinion that was okay to have. But when George Floyd was murdered, all of that changed. And everyone realized that, Black lives, maybe they do matter. But then now we're in a moment where I think a lot of the solutions that are being proposed aren't actually understanding how big of a problem this is and the impact that it has, Like when we talk about racism in media, it's not an abstract thing. It just means that, people who look like me, and even me specifically, we don't get jobs, We don't get hired. We have to leave journalism and do other things, We work tirelessly to get in management positions, only to be disrespected and treated with contempt. I have so many instances in my personal life where all of these things constantly happen. And when you accuse people of racism, they will always say that they're not racist. Nobody in the society will ever acknowledge the fact that they've contributed to this problem. And we're the ones who bear the brunt of it. My life is the one, and my friends and my family, we're the ones who, have to bear the brunt of it. So I just have to ask, how big of a problem is this? And how seriously do people want to solve it? Because if you want to solve it seriously, look at how messed up the system is, and take it seriously. Because if CBC's roof caved in, or if all their printers stopped working, or if they couldn't use their computers for a week, they would take that very seriously and they would solve those problems immediately. But for racism, we have to wait.
Kyle, you mentioned about diversity committees, and there's so many organizations that talk about having diversity and inclusion committees, but unless these committees actually have the authority to enact change, is it just more lip service? And it really does need to be ingrained in every aspect of an organization. And the policies have to have substance, from hiring, advancement, how stories are framed, the types of stories and issues covered, the workplace environment, anti-racism statements. Good intentions are really worthless without action and progressive and positive impact. So, I mean, I'm of the mind of Oumar and Anita, in the sense that you don't want to be cynical, but you hear a lot of talk, but I think we see very little action.
I really enjoy being on panels with optimistic people, because I struggle with that quite a bit in this industry. And I think in regards to diversity committees, inclusion committees, stuff like that, yeah, I mean, you're totally right, Gurvinder. I think like if they don't have any sort of power, it's really just how can we operate within the system to try to make things marginally better. And that's sort of basically what I've had to do over the past little while. I don't have any particular power, with the committee, but what we thought we could do is try to promote more diverse programming, or creating like spreadsheets that have, diverse sources on it that aren't just speaking about their communities, but are speaking about politics or economics or whatever. These are both things that are helpful, sure, but does it really change anything in the long run? Probably not. But those are the only things that it felt like we were able to do, was that we were only able to really work within a system that exists in front of us. And, we're not trusted to have really any more power than that, because, I guess why would they? They don't want rapid change that quickly, right? So, I think, yeah, I mean, CBC has a diversity and inclusion arm now, which is diversity inclusion at the management level, that's pretty good. I think the the arms probably is still pretty small, but I think that's certainly a lot better than some of the things that we're able to do locally. That being said, I think, some of that work that, we were doing is valuable. I don't disregard that at all. But it really had its limitations for sure. Especially when it first started, it felt like we were very much like, look at us in Edmonton, we have a diversity committee, not so much like, look at us, here's all the work that we're doing to try and decolonize and to dismantle systemic racism. So.
Okay, I think we can we could go on and on and on this, but we need to get to a couple of questions here. One of the questions is, I'd like to hear the panelists' thoughts on the conglomerization of media and the decline of independent newspapers and the effect this has had on representation of the community and racism.
So I can speak to that. Over the past 10 years, more than 200 local news outlets across the country have shuttered their doors. And a lot of this is due to the decline of the advertising model, like I mentioned before. So the end result of that, as I mentioned, is that it impacts democracy, it impacts relationships between people in communities. And I mean, like, this is obviously a net negative effect on our society. What was the question specifically, Gurvinder, in light of, yeah.
On the conglomerization of media and the decline of independent newspapers and the effect this has had on representation of the community and racism.
Yes, thank you. So yeah, and so there's increasing consolidation among the major media organizations, as we can see with Post Media, which is also extremely problematic. And the result is, like, I mean, this is a negative for, like, all communities across the board, but it's particularly bad for our communities that are already underrepresented, right? Because your community is already overlooked, and then on top of that, there's just, like, less of a budget and resources for local news, which actually really gets into the nuance of people's day-to-day. So we're going to be, I mean, the fear is that a lot of underrepresented communities are going to be doubly invisible, and then coverage is going to get even more reductive and stereotypical or completely disappear altogether. So that is, like, definitely a major concern, which is why there's so much energy towards, like, at least in the spaces I'm in, there's a lot of really smart people in journalism around the world that are trying to figure out the business model question, because it really gets to the heart of everything, including diversity issues in media. So yeah, that's all I wanted to say about that.
Another question is, what is the role of the communications departments of municipalities as major contributors to the local news?
I can jump in there. I think as journalists, you walk into your job every day and you have to have a collection of potential stories that you pitch to an editor. So the way that you get those stories is in a multiple variety of ways. Social media is a big part in, journalism today. So you will look at Twitter and see, what's going on in your city. You'll, have sources, you'll check other publications. But a really, really big part of journalism is press releases. So press releases are, when communications departments have things going on in their companies. So for example, when the city of Edmonton launches a new program, they put out a press release and they send it to journalists. So that's the connection, I think, between communications departments at the city and journalists. I think you can then ask yourself a lot of questions and kind of start understanding things from there. So how much can journalists actually publish from press releases without fact checking them or, getting another perspective? What is the actual relationship? Is that actually codified in terms of, what's ethically allowed with, journalists working with communications people? And I think a lot of this is seen as mundane and probably relatively technical, but I think realistically, it plays a really big part in the stories that you read at the end of the day. So I think people should pay a lot of attention to it, and it's important.
Let's do another question here. In health promotion education, there are tools that help professionals authoring these resources access the resources they create on a number of domains, including diversity, stereotype, stigma, present language. Are there tools available to help those in the media question their work?
I can try with this one. I don't know that there are, save for Twitter. Every time, if there's somebody who, writes an article that other people might view as, disingenuous, it specifically happens with columnists a lot. Then people there's no real mechanism as far as I know. Maybe, I don't know, maybe some other folks have heard. But Twitter is sort of a vehicle for that, I guess, a little bit. Although it's kind of funny when National Post columnists will write a column. I think there might be like a directive for Post Media to not say anything about it. But, I think I think that's probably the only vehicle that I know of. I hadn't actually thought of that. Maybe that might be a place to do it, but I don't know. People are already pretty strapped already. I don't know if anybody else has heard anything about it, but.
And I think we're about out of time. Rosiva?
Yeah, we can thank you to Clayton, who has extended our time. We were supposed to go until 2:30. We've gone into 2:42. So yeah, I think if we want to leave that there, thank you so much to everyone for all of your contributions. This was a really wonderful session, and we very much appreciate everyone's input, as well as folks who are commenting and interacting with the Q&A. So we have our website where you can sign up for our newsletter to know about the next session that is taking place. And if you'd like to share our thoughts with us, please fill out the feedback form as well as our emails that are on there. So thank you so much for your time, everyone.